Um, hey everybody. I'm a little sleepy, so I guess I'm not very
It
woke.
took a moment.
That was my pun intro. I thought it was
You're no, awesome.
I give it at least a 6 out of 10. Sorry. So today we're talking about this is the lies that bind us. We're talking about the social myth, or actually some interrelated social myths around wokeness or cancel culture, all those sort of things that we've heard a lot in the last decade, especially, but especially leading up to this recent election. It was kind of a collection of boogeymen that ended up driving everyone into the loving, waiting arms of Donald Trump. So we're going to talk about that.
And we have a guest.
Yeah.
So
You
we
want
have
you,
on with us Benji or Benjamin. So Benji, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello. My name is Benjamin Faye. My friends call me Benji, which means you can call me Benji too. I am a writer, a speaker, former educator, and current co-host of the White Homework podcast, where we talk about racism and debunk a lot of racist ideology and racist things. And this month we've been focusing more on good things because it's Black History Month, so we're talking about wonderful things that have happened in and amongst the lives of Black people, which is very exciting. But yeah, that is a little bit about me in a nutshell.
Nice. Well, welcome to this is our second episode. So you're playing your part in making history, Benji.
I'm so honored to be here. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Right there from the beginning.
Yeah. Someday we'll look back on this and remember this conversation we had way back when before the roving bandits started hitting the wastelands and we were all driven into the dome cities.
I remember the before times.
Before times.
I like that you still have aspirations that we will have dome cities in the future.
You know, I got to have some optimism. But it'll be those cool dome cities where there's a projection on the inside so whole generations will grow up thinking that there's a sun and stars, but it's actually a bleak wasteland on the outside of the domes.
I feel like we're getting to the point where that's like the positive future. Like maybe humanity will get lucky enough to build a dome.
I just love this like Dune Mad Max thing that you're going for.
My brain always goes to that. It just goes to that. But just to reel it back in, we're talking about wokeness or woke culture. I mean, I've heard it in so many ways, but like it wasn't that long ago. We were saying this before we hit record, that the word woke was not a derogatory term at all. Like this isn't some sort of thing where there's linguistic drift over 100 years. This is captured language from over a period of a couple of years.
Yeah.
So, yeah. What do you think about that reality that we're trying to name here?
Yeah, Benji, you got a lot of thoughts on this because you talk about this a lot on Blue Sky and stuff. So I'm gonna let you take this on, and I have a couple things I'm sure I'm gonna follow up with.
So my reaction to kind of the evolution of how we use the term woke now as a pejorative, it's really interesting considering how that word started. And just to kind of provide some context, as far back as I can tell, the first utterance of the word woke in its initial context, the context in which Black people used it, started in about 1939 with an artist named Leadbelly, who said, "Stay woke out here" on the recording. And what that referred to was Black people protecting themselves from white folks in the Jim Crow era, meaning that they killing us out here, so stay alert, right? Stay woke. Keep your eyes peeled, that kind of thing. So it was a gathering thing, but it was also just an awareness thing of like, be on your guard. And that's kind of what it's always meant, because so little has changed in terms of the way that Black people are treated in America. The nuts and bolts of it may be changing, but The impetus is the same. The methodologies may change, but the basic core of it is the same. And so when oppression would come, when different versions of it would show up, it would be stay woke. Another version of that is when somebody was woke in the Black community, it meant that they knew a lot about the history of America and how it had treated Black people. So you were aware of what the Black Panthers had done and were doing. You were aware of what was going on around you all the time. So it was about that kind of alertness, being woke in that sense. But it was still very much contained within the Black community. What I think happened in the last 10 years is that a lot of Black culture and a lot of Black linguistic elements get co-opted into mainstream culture. I've watched all kinds of things come into the fore like that. I remember 20 years ago, it was "You Go Girl," and like little stuff that like Black women say, that kind of became part of the broader zeitgeist. And even younger people, Gen Z, have certain slang terms that they use that are kind of part of the major zeitgeist that came from Black people. And so woke became that thing. And I think that when Republicans saw that it was gaining traction, they saw another opportunity to create a boogeyman. They saw another opportunity to create a weapon. And so they saw woke as an opponent. So they said, okay, we're going to create this thing called wokeness, because that wasn't a term before Republicans started at all. We're going to look at this as a villain, the same way they looked at CRT as a villain, the way they look at DEI as a villain, the way they looked at affirmative action for many, many years as an opponent. Because what they were really saying is, we don't want Black people and other groups, but Black people in particular, we don't want them to be a contributing member of society if we can help it. And so we're going to push back against everything that supports them so we can push back against everything they are. And that led to like the Stop Woke Act in Florida and a few other things. But I just see the last 10 years as just, this is what happens when you don't leave Black folk alone. Ultimately, in addition to the historical context, but that's my main thought, is like, man, this is what happens when you leave us alone.
Once it kind of started entering, it started as a derogatory term hurled from the right, kind of this sort of, I don't know, passive aggressive, smarmy sort of attack. And then it kind of like bled into other groups. Like, I remember the first times I heard leftists, and liberals. So like, leftist to me means people who hate capitalism as a starting point usually, and then there's a whole bunch of groups in there. So the Democrats and even progressives aren't really necessarily leftist, although progressives can be, I suppose. And then liberal just kind of usually means that centrist kind of individual rights focused sort of free market kind of thing.
What we call liberal is conservative, basically everywhere else.
Yeah, so neoliberal, really.
Right.
Yeah.
And I started hearing them use it because the neoliberals would accuse folks of being woke because they're just getting carried away. It's too much. We need to be level-headed about this and not so polarizing. That kind of instinct. And then on the left, I heard it as a way of critiquing, like progressive performativity, like white people acting a certain way because they know that's how they're supposed to act, to be like progressive seeming, but it seemed empty. And then before you know it, people on all sides were critiquing like Target or Wells Fargo for sponsoring Pride as them trying to be performatively woke. And so it became this sloppy term of accusation that within just a matter of a few years just got out of hand as the big boogeyman. For me, it was irritating just because I knew better, but it wasn't exactly part of my cultural resistance, like the well springs I was drawing off of for resistance. So how did it strike you, Benji? Like when people started using this term woke in all kinds of really stupid and shitty ways?
It was frustrating. It was extremely frustrating because it was, and I'll just be honest, it was mostly white people attacking other white people.
Oh, sure.
And I am a fan of humorous white on white crime. So like when when they're going back and forth about who's virtue signaling or who's out virtue signaling somebody else, there's a certain spectator element where I'm just sitting back with popcorn being like, oh man, I am gleefully staying out of white folk business. I love this.
I don't even need to add salt to this popcorn.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm getting salt and tea. Let's go. But like in another context, I'm just like, you're arguing over something that neither one of you actually understands the roots of. And this is ultimately why I feel like a lot of progressive and leftist movements end up falling short. Because a lot of it is rooted in that performative thing of like, oh, I'm going to listen to Black people only insofar as it supplants my authority. So I still get to be the leader of this thing, and I still get to take everything from you. You don't actually have to have any prominent place in these movements. I just get to take a thing and then christen myself as woke because I listened to a couple of podcasts, or I read Wide Awake, or I listened to this person or that person speak. And usually it's a white person who got something from a Black person. So you're not even actually listening to Black people. You're just listening to a message you got, several miles downriver. And so the whole thing, when it's not kind of hilarious, it's incredibly frustrating because nobody's asking where this comes from. There's no desire to learn the roots of a thing. And that's when a lot of Black creators have to step in and be like, hey, this is getting out of hand, but not for the reasons you think it's getting out of hand. And here's why. And oh, by the way, had you asked the question initially, we wouldn't have to do all of this emotional and practical labor to get out in front of it. So I don't know. It's gotten a little ridiculous, to be honest with you.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you have a backpack called privilege, and there's a lot of things in the back. Sorry. Remember that? How it used to be like white people when we'd study how to not be as privileged, the backpack imagery would come up. And then it'd be about weights. Everyone would pour out their backpacks and see who has the most privilege in the room. Or stand on one side, Everyone who could afford to go on a trip on a plane before the age of 18, stand on this side of the room. Like that kind of way of making privilege quantifiable. And then if you get too far up, too many points, and you're like broadcasting it a little too loudly, then you're woke. Like that's how it's usually how it's framed, is that the most irritating white people are the most woke, and it's a bad thing. And it just strips everything, like you were saying, out of any context or meaning, and it becomes this sort of white on white crime, but not even in a fun way. Like it's not
right.
Not even in a consequential way in anything besides like overall adding to a sort of racist shittiness.
Right. But that's the nature of colonialism, though, is to rip things out from their context.
Yeah.
Like in order for certain groups of people to be considered white, they had to check their heritage at the door. There's a lot of Italian folks who had to check that. Polish people, German people. It's like, no, you are white now. And so very similarly, I see a similar thing happen to language, where it's like, in order for this to be used to the degree that we want to use it, whether we're aware of it or not, we have to strip it of its context. It's the Republican playbook. They do this all the time, and it's not just with woke, it's with a lot of different things.
Yeah. And that's something that I did work on. I don't remember how long ago it was, but at some point where I coined the term appropriated linguistic harassment, which is basically the idea of intentionally taking language to harass other people. But like it really came to the forefront for like that understanding whenever Marjorie Taylor Greene started using "say her name" for um, the one girl that was murdered in Georgia, and they passed laws and stuff to harm to harm immigrants because of that. But intentionally using a phrase that has been for predominantly non-white people and non-straight people, because or maybe I'm confusing "rest in power" as being a queer saying
No.
as well as a black, but it could be both.
It could
But
be both, yeah.
yeah, but intentionally using the phrasing from marginalized communities to spread harm towards marginalized communities. It is something that has been repeated constantly throughout our history, and we even see this like moving backwards like whenever we reshape history to be more uh like more in line with what white supremacy wants history to say. Like PragerU does this all the time whenever they teach their histories. They'll take these words and be like, take them out of context and like change the definition to actually like back up to justify harm that, you know, ancestors did. It's an intentional action of taking these words, and we do see it with woke. We saw it with critical race theory, where the meaning is the word is taken, the meaning is changed to where it's like slightly connected to the original meaning, but then at the same time is then taken to like this extreme, which is out of the context of what it originally meant, to create a dog whistle. Where now people don't have to like, part of it is the fact that conservatives don't want to say you know, those people who understand systemic injustice, like, no, they'll just say the woke people, because it's a dog whistle. They don't want to say what they actually mean. They want to just use a term that incites an emotional reaction because they've been able to take it and appropriate it into something that does cause harm. So a lot of it is also to like reframe some of the motivations, because nobody actually wants to say, you know, those people who are upset with police brutality, like they're not saying that because that doesn't look that good on you whenever you're like, I'm okay with police brutality.
I mean, you know, there's this other piece of it, and you know, Benji, you were talking about kind of the origins of the phrase woke. It's, you know, stay on the alert because there's stuff, right? We have to be aware of to stay safe. And I've noticed that this is usually where things, you know, go adrift. Usually there's someone who's from a marginalized community where they need safety, or a group of people need safety, and they start trying to articulate their needs for safety. And oftentimes there's like some practices assumed in there. Like, for this to be a safe kind of space for us to meet, we need to have these things. And so, and there's all sorts of little signals for that. The language some people use, the way they're showing up in a space. And so someone from the outside who sees it all as abstraction and they don't feel a lack of safety will see it all as policing.
Yeah.
And being nitpicky. And so then they start being derogatory. So this idea of me expecting spaces I'd be in to not, like, I don't want to be misgendered.
Right.
I want to be able to go to a bathroom, all these things. And I'm not going around policing everyone who doesn't comply. But if I go into a gay bar, this is a great example that I've noticed. There's so many gay bars that are supposed to be for all queer folks, but they'll have like single stall gendered bathrooms, right? And so if I'm frustrated about that, and like want them to change that policy, I could just see some random, you know, liberal thinking that I'm being too woke. But there's safety issues involved with that. And that's there's more safety issues when you start talking about like the historical realities that different marginalized communities have experienced. And so someone from the outside can see it all as abstract and end up being about posturing, which is really a projection, because my expectation of liberals in spaces that are somewhat more engaged than them are like that. They're going to just see those things as performative, and they're going to figure out how to perform themselves. And so they'll interpret everything that way. So all the controversies that I can think of around trans people, like Dave Chappelle, stand-up comedy, J.K. Rowling, all those things are, if you speak out against them with any strength, you're accused of being too woke.
Yeah, it's like,
and it erodes the safety issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because my thing is, it's like, okay, if woke is a bad thing, then what's the alternative? Like, if for those people who are saying like you're too woke, okay, what's the appropriate level of woke?
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like the appropriate level of woke means you don't want to have to be faced with your own bigotry, particularly in the case of somebody like Dave Chappelle, who should know better.
Yeah, he's had every opportunity to know better.
He's had every opportunity to know better, and we have him making jokes about, black and white tension. Like, a lot of that is a huge part of his comedy, going back to Robin Hood Men in Tights in the early 90s. So this idea that he is not aware, like, for him to use woke in that way, or for him to embrace woke in that way, is so stunningly irresponsible. And maybe not stunning anymore because he's done it multiple times. But this idea of getting to legislate in his idea of what comedy is or isn't. Or, I mean, you could use that for anything. This idea of like, oh, you're being too much of this. Okay, but what is the benefit of not being this? If somebody's getting hurt, or if somebody runs the risk of being hurt, if there's even the possibility, then isn't your version of too woke worth it? And then your version of whatever you think normal is not worth it? Like, as you mentioned, there's an element of privilege there. There's an element of, I don't want to have to move at all. I'm immediately reminded of Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael, however you refer to him. He wrote an essay about this in 1971, referring to like the pitfalls of liberalism. And what he was saying was that liberal folks, or liberal-minded folks, want movement without having to give up their position. So when somebody says, oh, like, you care about trans people and don't want them to be hurt, you're being a little bit too woke. What they're really saying is, I want the impression of movement. I want to feel like I'm a supporter without actually having to do the things necessary to support. So I want to be seen on the right side of history, but I don't want to do the things that make history. Does that make sense? So I'm always curious about, like, you would rather be asleep? Now, like, there's some elements in which, like, yeah, there's a lot of times in a day where I'd rather be asleep. But that's not because I don't want to be involved in social issues. That's because I'm 36 years old and I value nap time. That has nothing to do with societal situations. My thing is, why wouldn't you want to be aware, especially if you care about lives and are interested in saving them?
There's a line in the book, Trans Rad Femme, and I'm not thinking of the author off the top of my head, so I'll have to figure that out later. Which she basically says, if you love somebody, you will hate what harms them, and or be angry at what harms them, and that is just completely true. Like, especially, so we live in a growing Christian nationalist nation, who still somehow claims that they love their neighbors somehow. But at the same time, like, you do have to realize that if you are going to, quote, love your neighbor, then you have to be angry at that which causes harm.
Right.
And the truth is there are so many people who do not want to recognize that harm is being caused, or don't want to recognize that the system that they are taking part of is the thing that is causing harm, because we have this such hyper individualistic idea of like, hey, I I buy bananas, that doesn't mean that I support support killing civilians in um what, Brazil, wherever
Mhm.
the banana company was charged with like actually killing people.
Yeah.
But you are like, the part of the thing is like, you live in a society that is so interconnected that we use hyper individualism to ignore the fact that we're interconnected, and thus
Yep.
ignore the fact that we have a responsibility to other people in this society. Um, and so, like, yeah, recognizing systemic injustice, recognizing that um, different people will have different responses to being pulled over by the police based off their skin color. Like, ignoring that uh, doesn't make you a good person. It makes you a horrible person. Like, a normal person should see, oh, this is causing harm. Maybe we should stop doing it. That's normal. That's not even good. That's like more like that is
It's bare
the
minimum stuff.
minimum. It's bare minimum. We're not even getting to the bare minimum because we're like, no, that's woke. And we use this emotional manipulation that comes with dog whistles to ignore the fact that we are upholding systems of harm.
Right. I think that for a lot of people, especially when you have conversations about the bigger things like the capitalism conversation,
hmm
about how there's no way to ethically consume in capitalism, is because everything is interconnected. It's because,
Mhm.
you know, and it's hard to know what's what because everything you see and hear in mainstream America is owned by the same like six people.
hmm
Yeah.
Um, thanks, Clinton. Um, and you know, I'm a big nerd about the Telecommunications Act of 1996. That's a lot where a lot of that specific thing comes from. But
Yeah, that's a big one.
the whole massive piece of legislation,
Yeah.
massive. Um, but the it's hard for people to recognize that, like, because most people are just trying to be good people,
hmm
right? They're not trying to be actively complicit in somebody else's harm. But when you tell them that they are passively
Mhm.
contributing to somebody else's harm, um, and that in the existing system, it is built on somebody else having
Yeah.
less, it becomes this immediate pearl clutching of, what? No, I pay my taxes, I recycle, blah, 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 blah. I'm like,
hmm
okay, cool. But when your tax dollars are funding a genocide or several,
Several.
you
Yeah.
have to start maybe asking a couple of questions about, okay, I am now complicit in this thing. And it doesn't mean that I intend to be complicit. I'm not here to make moral absolutes about you as a person, but it does mean that you are accountable for that information now.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is the entire premise of The Good Place, like
hmm
the
Yes.
TV show. Like,
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. I'm like,
In
if
this,
you, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, people should watch that. It's
Fantastic.
it's
it's a smart
yeah.
and funny show.
Yeah.
You can do both. The, and it gets back to this question of safety and thriving. Like, I assume there's two things going on when someone starts throwing around the term woke as a derogatory comment. One is they don't actually understand or see or appreciate the level of harm that's being perpetuated in our society. And two, I think that they are confusing like system and interpersonals. I see that happen all the time. So if like using Dave Chappelle, like how can Dave Chappelle is like, he's done so much, he's so funny, and here are all these, butthurt liberals coming after him, and they want to cancel him. And so what they're seeing, the only harm they're seeing is against Dave Chappelle being unjustly accused. And then they worry about his cancellation, which I know it's been really hard for him as he's become even more richer and has even more of a platform than he used to. Same with J.K. Rowling. Like her cancel has been, Donald Trump's cancellation. All these really, they were able to leverage these for power.
Yep.
And people still don't seem to get it because they don't recognize power in these dynamics. They see it as interpersonal beefs.
That's it exactly. That is it exactly. To a far lesser degree, you're looking at Daniel Penny and Kyle Rittenhouse.
Mm-hmm.
How people didn't want to, quote unquote, cancel them. And I'm like, Kyle Rittenhouse drove from like 2 states away to kill somebody.
Yeah, it was premeditated, like opportunistic murder.
And he didn't even drive. His mom drove him.
Yeah.
So
I didn't know that part.
Yeah.
His mom drove him.
He didn't have a license at the time.
I want to know what their Mother's Day cards are like, because that's going to be fucked up. Sorry.
Oh man, it's that same thing of like they can coast it because what is cancel culture actually?
Mm-hmm.
What are we really saying when we say canceling somebody? Like you're worried about their career. I'm worried about the trans kids who are getting beat up at school because Dave Chappelle wanted to make a joke for 10 seconds. I'm worried about women who are being harassed. I'm worried about women who are being used as proxies to hurt trans people. I'm worried about the actual issue. You're out here actually the ones who are getting annoyed and are being the real snowflakes in the equation because you care more about somebody who will never pay you for your work, somebody who you don't know.
Someone who's really to them just an abstraction. That somehow is still more of a person to them than I am.
Exactly.
And people don't want to interrogate that. I mean, this is real world consequence for me. I'm actually dropping an article on our Substack, which is a commercial for folks to check out our Substack. The link's up here. I'll leave this up for a second. And I share the story. Early in my transition, I struggled a lot with one of my favorite things, which is karaoke, because I love karaoke. I do it all the time. I talk about it all the time, but I am a low bass. Like I can sing, like, "You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch." I can go that far down and I can sing high, but sometimes I sing something that is demonstrably not in the feminine range. And so I become obvious to people. One night after karaoke at the VFW in town here, some guy followed me and my friend into the parking lot. And he was trying to get my attention, and he caught up to us, and it was kind of scary. And he demanded that I tell him my opinion of Dave Chappelle because he wanted to know whether or not I was one of those trannies who could take a joke or not. Right. So 2 women in a parking lot with a drunk guy, that's not a great, and he's yelling. We had to just basically figure out how to diffuse him and tell him to go home. That sort of stuff happens all the time. And Dave Chappelle isn't helping anything. And I get that. I don't think Dave Chappelle should be sent to the gulag. Right. I don't think he should be tortured to death. Right. I don't think he should even go to jail. I don't even think he should lose his ability to do livelihood, like work. I just don't think he should be praised and uplifted for punching down. And I think it's okay for us to say, maybe he shouldn't have so much clout and influence anymore. Like that's really all cancel culture is a way of saying, hey, this isn't cool, and we should like minimize your platform so that you can't do so much harm.
Yeah.
I don't understand why it's seen as so odious to people to try to do that.
Because the truth is there is a significant level of harm that that language from people with more power than somebody else like causes. Because because Dave Chappelle made jokes, you were put in a position where you were actually probably not very safe. Whereas he gets to go home at night, possibly with security because, whatever, he's rich. But like that is what he got to say jokes, but it impacted your life. And we live in a time where we have people um literally like calling trans people groomers and pedophiles, which is going to lead to harm against LGBTQ plus people, especially in states where um where people can literally murder queer people and say that that person came onto them and it was a response because we have gay panic laws that protect people when they murder a queer person. And they don't have to prove that a queer person came onto them. They can just say they came on. I panicked. Like that is the reality that we live in, where because of language from people with power, and we're seeing this with the current president and Vice President Trump, where the language is is being used to cause real harm against real people. And over this next year, we're going to see increased violence against trans people because of the hatred that is being spewed by people with power. We are going to see um, more violence against immigrants because of the dehumanization of uh, of immigrants within the United States, unless you have $5 million to apparently buy a gold gold card.
The gold card instead of the green card.
Yeah. And we're going to see increased violence against Black people with jobs because they're going to be called DEI hires, even though like the DEI is about like ensuring that you are hiring people only on merit. Like you don't change the standards. You just make sure that you're
The
not
standards
hiring
are
people
upheld.
solely because they're white men. Like that's what DEI is. So literally removing DEI is removing merit from the equation.
Yeah.
But we are going to see increased harm, especially over these next few years. I mean, unless you know Musk and Trump's approval ratings continue to plummet to the point where even radical conservatives don't like them. But that's probably not going to happen.
It's probably not going to happen
for at least too long. So we are going to see increased both physical and emotional violence against nearly every marginalized community because language has power.
And the defense, it all comes down to any harm I do to someone who is marginalized is justified insofar as I'm scared and I'm in a more protected category than they are. So cops can murder people because they're scared, as long as they're not a white woman who gets accidentally shot or whatever, because it's like there's this assumed power dynamic and I'm scared. It's enough. Just like a man at a bar, if he perceives me as hitting on him and his masculinity feels threatened, and so he beats me to death. Well, he was scared. Like, so this rearranging of people who have been historically oppressed, exploited, as long as you can frame them as angry enough and unreasonable enough, then you who have more social power can say that I was scared. We're seeing this all over the place. And to me, this is where it gets weird, that I still see people on the left or progressive people who would say that they care about all the things that Donald Trump is like destroying. will still use the term like, "Oh, that's wokeness run amok," or "those woke liberals." They're
or look down on people who do get angry.
yes,
Which is an like I said, anger is an appropriate response to harm. And
Mhm.
the fact is, especially the white ability to remain in a state of not being angered, mostly because of protections, because things don't
Yeah.
necessarily affect them. Um, like that is actually not the appropriate response to harm. Being
Right.
able to say, I'm going to stay calm, like calm-headed during what is going on and act out of calmness and stuff. Like, sure, there is a level of like being able to think clearly. However, there is a hyper weaponization of the fact that, oh, this person is angry. We need to like, so now their opinion doesn't matter or is less valid. Um, when in reality, anger is an appropriate response. There is no way around the fact that like people should be angry at harm, and we're
Yeah.
really at a spot where the ability to not show anger is in fact weaponized to
Mhm.
turn a blind eye to harm.
Yeah. I would say the left kind of has two problems. Number one, they have no grid for evangelicalism, which is why they didn't see Project 2025 coming, and also why they don't see the dogmatic approach isn't going to work. The very
Mhm.
Spartan, it's either this way or no way. It's like, because you don't have a grid for that, you don't see why it's harmful. The other issue is that there is very little decolonization that has happened. So they've learned a couple of new terms and they ran with it, and now they're just this new thing without having to deal with the old thing. There's no attempt to disassemble the colonial mindset, and so they are approaching liberation with a colonial mindset, which is
Mhm.
to effectively negate the liberation element.
Yeah.
Which is why we see so many of them still using woke in a pejorative sense, because they haven't decolonized to the point where they're like, hey, maybe that's a problem for I say my goals are.
Yeah.
Maybe I wasn't trying to be virtue signaling, but in my inaction and my unwillingness to educate myself, I have become a virtue signaling person because of it.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of saw the same thing with the term like harm reduction amongst especially white liberals,
Right.
where it was this thing of being informed about like how human bodies actually respond to certain things. And then it's become I don't know, what would you what would you call what it is now? It's just like kind of this term that is used to be like, oh, I'm informed, but really it's like being used by a lot of people that aren't actually informed. They're just kind of like wanting
it
to
beca-
use it to to sound credible,
Mhm.
without actually doing the work of understanding like what systems of harm they are still upholding.
Right.
yes, it's allowing their words to do the work for them, which is
Mhm.
performative, but it's also uh, kind of becomes a thought terminating cliche after a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, in all of it, it's like people in abusive relationships can sometimes recognize this sort of dynamic of where uh, if the abusive one is doing real abuse and harm, they can easily make it seem like it's their victim's fault, right?
Mhm.
And we see this in kind of more of a polite social discourse ways. Whenever I get the pinched face from somebody who's like, "Well, I just feel like I have to walk on eggshells all the time with you,"
Mhm.
which then makes me the problem because I once
Yeah.
pointed out that I experienced harm from them. Um, and that to me, all this is kind of like that writ large. It's like,
Yeah.
how dare you tell me I'm not a good person? Like, well, I didn't say that. I just said you shouldn't say that shit and be able to just get away with it like nothing happened. It's like, you're saying I'm evil. I think you're the problem now
Yeah.
because you're being too, I don't want to say the word uppity because it's wrong, but like they kind of go into that headspace.
Yeah.
And it's almost impossible to have a conversation with someone in that space because they're so abstracted from reality. And they're going to automatically interpret anything you say as you being irrational and anxious, and they'll feel like that's true because they're anxious, but they're not recognizing it's their own anxiety.
Yep.
Like it's this weird dynamic. It's, and so you see this sort of thing where, like, the performativity of all this, is so toxic even before it gets to that level of using woke as a slander thing. Because it's, you saw this after Trump's first election. You had all these people show up to surge meetings or Black Lives Matter stuff, and it was people anxiously performing. And then the moment it became socially okay not to have to feel like they need to perform, all of a sudden they're throwing the term woke at people. There's this sort of way in which it's all performative, but they can't, people who are stuck in that mindset, and I know I'm making some huge generalizations here, will just assume that, the people who are really upset and actually doing the protesting and organizing are the ones who are anxiously performative. It's weird to get accused of the very thing that those people in those positions of, like, punching down are actually guilty of.
Yeah.
And we saw this quite a bit within the nonprofit space. Like, the last 4 years have been rough for nonprofits. They're working in I know I just did a rant on this word, but working in harm reduction, working, but like they're actually in that work, working in spaces of social justice and things like that, where um during the end of Trump's first presidency, there was a lot of people interested. There were people learning about systemic racism. Even the seminary that expelled me for being trans, like, did this entire seminar on racism within the United States. Like, that is how much, like, there were people wanting to do the work of understanding what was going on. As soon as Biden was elected, there was just like this drop off of people caring. And we had 4 years of growing apathy within these spaces where a lot of the people that have been consistent about the work, that they didn't just jump into it whenever it's popular, saw like support and donations and money and volunteers all decline over the last 4 years because it was no longer that in thing to do. And so, especially on what we say in our political system on the left or the liberals, um, it was never actually about changing the system. It was about not being associated with Trump or not being associated with Republicans that were being all crazy and but because of that apathy and stuff and the lack of actually wanting to make real change within society, we ended up with Trump again 4 years later. Like, that, I mean, that's kind of what happens whenever you are performative and don't actually put in the work. You end up having things come back and come back worse. And that's kind of where we're at. We've had 4 years of people who said all the right things be like, nope, we're done now. And then, like, after losing the election, we had people say, no, we were too
far to the
supportive of
left.
trans people, too supportive of trans people, and we lost the election because of that. Like, no, you didn't. Like, Harris threw trans people under the bus pretty good. And one of the last things that she talked about trans people was um trying to say that Trump respected gender affirming care, and that was a bad thing. Like,
What?
because he fought because while he was president, it was the law for prisoners to receive gender affirming care. And so, like, there were prisoners who received gender affirming care and surgeries who were incarcerated under Trump. And in an interview, she reminded the world, reminded that actually Trump is this pro gender affirming care person.
Yeah.
Like, she threw us under the bus major. So, like, I don't want to hear it that Democrats went too far affirming of trans people whenever, like, they didn't care about us.
Democrats went the other way. They tried to go far right. I mean, what do you mean the most lethal military?
That was
or the biggest issue was accepting Republican framing without any ounce of pushback. So in particular, where it concerns trans people, there was a lot of conversation where people would ask the question of, do you think biological this or that should play in sports? The appropriate response is, I reject the premise of your question. But a lot of them said, no, I don't think biological males should compete in sports where there are women. And I'm like, oh, you're playing right into their hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you mean you went too far left? If you went too far left, Medicare for all would still be a thing you ran on, because even like in 2019, when Kamala Harris ran for president the first time, she ran on some kind of leftist ideas. She ran, like, one of which was Medicare for all. And then by the time the Democratic Party platform came out in 2024, most of the stuff was gone, including abolishment of the death penalty.
Yeah,
so
that was a huge one.
That was a huge one. So they forsook everything they were to move left, or excuse me, to move right, and then put Liz Cheney on stage when you could have had a Palestinian.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving left or moving right to the point where the policies that most of the policies that she was running on, first of all, I know weren't hers. They were DNC like talking points that they put together, thinking that they would win. But it's nearly indistinguishable of George W. Bush, minus she was still okay with same-sex marriage and abortion. Other than that, like economy-wise, military-wise, all of that was it was early 2000s Republican talking points, and so like they ran to the right to the point where the Democratic Party was basically early 2000s Republican Party.
Yeah, and it's interesting how like the sort of the accusations of wokeness, like they kind of come in a little bit of waves. Right after the Trump got elected, there was a big wave because it was like it was our fault. It was the two woke people's fault. I'm sure it'll happen. You know, it's died down a little bit because there's been a barrage of horrific activity from the executive branch. But it'll come back again soon. And I think a lot of it comes down to this sort of resentment from people with relative privilege losing some access to something themselves. Like they're worried now for themselves and they have to blame somebody. So they'll blame down. And it just kind of entrenches things. And then whenever like 4 years later, all their actions come back to bite them in the butt, they'll just blame whatever the further left group is then. It's impossible to really refute, because in their framework, the folks who cry out and do the canceling are seen as uncivil. It really becomes a breach of civility. And they don't want to say it out loud, but that's really what it comes down to, that we were doing things in a sloppy way, not following the rules, using cancellation, which is to me one of the weapons of the week, like James C. Scott's book Weapons of the Week. Like when you don't have a lot of access to systems of power, you're going to use what levers you have.
Yeah.
And they're going to not be the quote unquote appropriate ones. So having an online campaign to deplatform someone, they think it seems catty and uncivil, but it's, well, what can you do? There's not a huge trans voting bloc, right? The best we can do is try to add some sort of stigma to the idea of like being cozy with J.K. Rowling or other TERF people, but that somehow breaches etiquette. It ultimately comes down to etiquette over basic human decency.
Yeah.
And etiquette is always determined by those who already have power.
Correct.
I want to cancel having 3 forks and 3 spoons at fancy dinners. I don't even know how many. Speaking of etiquette, I don't know how to do that stuff. Knock it off. That's my position.
I forget what movie it was where they like taught people how to count like the times. and like which spoons and which sits on the left and the right.
I know that you go from inside to outside. I saw that in the movie once. Sorry.
I love that our closest adjacency to this is like a fictional product of like a story being told.
But,
like,
but are we talking about Princess Diaries?
Where she learned how to from inside to out?
Well,
Probably.
I don't remember. I know that she got like training to be the Princess of Genovia and like how to walk and all that stuff. I don't know.
Yeah.
That may be part of it.
There's been other movies like
I don't think it was Pretty Woman, was it?
Yeah, Pretty
Woman. Yeah,
was.
She has to learn too because she shoots the escargot out of the little.
Yes, that's probably what was in my head.
Yeah, and as silly as those examples are, I don't think people realize how much etiquette determines so much of the pattern of our lives. Because we think of, that etiquette as a hoity-toity thing. But like, you can tell someone's political position based on how much they lose their mind when someone stands up on stage when a candidate is giving a speech with a sign that says "Free Palestine."
Right.
The issue isn't that, then they'll be like, well, if you want to help your cause, you can't act all vulgar like that. They don't use those words.
Which is what people said of like Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee, which, by the way, so I was, this is one of those things that radicalized me because I was in the military at the time. And like, I was sitting there like, I'm in the military. I'm like, my what I believed at the time was fighting for freedom and freedom of speech. Like, I have to stand for the flag because I'm in uniform, but Colin Kaepernick's a civilian. There's no regulation or anything. He's not doing anything disrespectful. What is happening is he is acting outside the way that you want him to act. Which is kind of telling because he was doing it as a protest to police brutality and systemic racism. And a bunch of white people got really mad that a black person didn't want to stand for a flag that was written when slavery was a thing.
Correct.
Like,
you see a
national anthem the national anthem was about winning a war with another country to maintain a nation that had slavery. Why is that our national anthem? But also, why would somebody whose like heritage comes from that background be required to respect that?
So Cap is a really interesting kind of take.
Yeah.
Because first of all, people get mad at folks taking a knee. I'm like, I remember going to my friend's football game 25 years ago, and at the end of the game, they all took a knee when their coach was speaking, because that's what they've been doing in sports since the beginning of time. So the initial idea of taking a knee actually isn't that bad. And number two, taking a knee was not what he did initially. He was sitting down, and someone asked him a question about it. Had no one asked him a question about it, it would have been a silent protest. But he became this signpost to where the NFL essentially blacklisted him. And
he started taking a knee after talking to
a Green Beret
military person. Yeah. And was like, do this because this is more respectful. Like, so all the people that are like, it's disrespectful for the troops. No, it wasn't. You just want it to be disrespectful to the troops.
Exactly. And who determines what respect is? Like, the idea of being fiery and speaking to the point of like civility and etiquette and things like that. For me, the wrinkle there is like, I have to speak a certain way. So as to avoid the angry black man trope. So I have to be more measured in my speech, because as it is, there's a daily debate in my mind about like the power of the things I say. I'm like, are the words I actually say powerful, or are they powerful, or do you think they're powerful because a white person affirmed it first?
Yeah.
And so I have to be extremely mindful about how I say things, because you're not going to hear me otherwise, because you're hardwired to look at me and think nothing comes from that.
And here's the thing. This is where the whole idea of wokeness or cancel culture or things like that kind of like reveal themselves. If you didn't perform your script well enough in the right context, you would lose access.
Right.
But no one would say that you were canceled. Cancellation
You're not popular enough to be canceled.
Cancellation is for people who have relative power and they lose it, and that's bad. Because why are we being mean on those people who have relatively more power? Like that's people don't say that part out loud, but like when I lose opportunities after I came out, no one called that cancellation.
Right.
Right. And so and this idea of being too woke, like we don't have a term for that for like I'm in the middle. Like if you're if you're a fascist, well, you're a fascist. But if you're too much like this sort of above it all colonial neoliberal person, we don't have like, oh, you're too sleep. We don't really we don't use that. So these weaponized terms are only used to punch down and further to the left.
Right.
And I don't understand how like well-meaning liberal types who aren't centrists don't get that. They want to use it for calling out hypocrisy among other white people for being too performative, as though like, why are you going around monitoring people's like employment of etiquette? What's going on there? Don't you have more energy than to like scope out the internet and like critique people who you think are a little bit hypocritical? Like that's not. It's becoming this performative game that doesn't have any consequences when it gets into that realm.
Yeah.
And I know that we're running low on time, but I wanted to add to that idea that Benji brought up, like needing that white person to back up something that you said. Like it's not we see it in a lot of spaces in so on TikTok our most popular video is one on the possibility of Joseph being gender expansive, which is just a video promoting the article that I wrote that's on our Substack. Hey, look, another advertisement. There's probably been like 10 to 15 people who have commented being like, at Dan McClellan, what's your opinion on this? And it's like, you don't need a white cishet man to like verify that something is thought out and researched. Like I respect the work that Dan does, and it's mostly okay. But he does have a very set perspective with kind of boundaries that he doesn't get out of. And so whenever like I spent over a month working on one article where I was reading Ugaritic, which is a language, by the way. Or not reading it myself, I was reading translations and things like that. And looking at these sources that, are 5,000 years old and putting together an argument. Dan has not done that work. So needing to go to Dan, the only reason you need that is because you need a cishet white guy to say, yeah, this is valid. You don't need that. Like if you think you need that type of permission, maybe work on that. But TikTok lets you delete people's comments. I've deleted every single one that tagged Dan McClellan because I'm petty.
I don't know who Dan McClellan is, so
he actually when we had that super popular tweet back when we were on Twitter about liberation being spoken of in the Bible, he did a video on it. And
is that the guy that did that video that you sent to me?
Yeah, which wasn't necessarily bad, but he was just like, yeah, this is kind of a perspective of liberation theology, somewhat newer. And it's like, you didn't actually deal with much going on here because his theological background is still very much European and white, and he doesn't really diverge from that, which is problematic. But at the same time, he does actually some really good work within his own framework that he uses.
Right.
But it only goes so far, and you need more you need more biblical scholarship than Dan McClellan.
Mm-hmm. Well, that there is this tendency, and like one of the myths of our society, although people don't name it as such, and it's kind of in the background, is this myth that this is a society without classes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that sort of like following necessary etiquette, needing approval from the specific people, and that we instinctively know who the lordly ones of each of these realms are. They're usually inscribed with whiteness, maleness, all the Protestantism. That happens so subconsciously that it's, if you name it, people think that you're just making stuff up and you're too woke. Like, this is where the reality testing thing comes in. Like,
Yeah.
I experienced this. My community experiences this. Other communities that have like similar commitments to justice have experienced this, but none of us have as much authority, even collectively, than that guy, because of your intrinsic understanding of authority and etiquette.
Yeah.
And the fact that I'm trying to challenge this will necessarily look like, if I'm challenging etiquette, it's because I'm too vulgar. If I'm challenging authority, it's because I'm too woke, too unstable, too whatever. And it just becomes this way of dismissing whole swaths of people because of a vibe without being able to recognize it as such. It's kind of large scale gaslighting that we have to deal with this stuff all the time.
Yeah. Well, Benji, thank you so much for coming on. We have been in talks for having you be on with Tori and do like a crossover episode with White Homework, which we still want to do. Just things got a little too crazy with trying to schedule, but we will do that soon.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just want to say thank you for coming on. Go ahead and do a little more self-promotion if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, so I am over on Instagram at Hey There Benji, and over on Blue Sky at benjaminfaye.bsky.social. As mentioned, the podcast that I'm on, White Homework, has an Instagram as well. It is on Instagram at White Homework. We are also at whitehomework.com. We're doing a patron drive as of the recording of this. So for Black History Month, we're just trying to have more people come on over and hang out with us over on Patreon. So whitehomework.com is where you can do that as well.
Yeah, and It's an awesome podcast. It's definitely one of my favorites, and I listen to it all the time. So, but also you and Tori are like really good friends, so there's that too.
We think very similarly, so it works out perfectly.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, Ash, you and I need to do a little self-promotion. You should subscribe to our YouTube, which is over here, unless you're listening to this on audio, on your whatever platform that you're using. You should also subscribe there because it gets it into the algorithm. But also, we're just going to be completely honest. We're trying to get enough subscribers and views so we can monetize our videos as well. And you can help CPI stay afloat by simply subscribing. That doesn't cost you anything, and liking videos gets it in the algorithm, and making comments helps the algorithm. Plus, if you comment, we will read it, and if you have ideas of things you want us to cover, like today we covered wokeness, if you leave comments or reach out to us or whatever, we will. I won't say that we're necessarily going to do it, but we will definitely take it in consideration. We do want audience input to help us like form the topics that we're doing. That doesn't guarantee, like, if you want us to talk about rabbits, it's probably not going to happen. But if you want us to, talk about
birds, because birds aren't real. They're government robots, so we can talk about that, I suppose.
Yeah. Sure.
That's a little inside joke crossover that I take with me wherever I go. Also, but also to point out, we are trying to grow our readership on Substack, specifically with paid subscribers. Obviously, most of our stuff is just available for anybody who passes by, but this is kind of this year, it's our big push, is to try to create revenue from these things so that we're not so based on donors who may have been donors in the past and stopped after I came out, or are upset about some of the positions we take. It's really difficult to do kind of stuff in spirituality spaces as trans women. So readers and viewers is kind of what we're hoping for, and help us out if you can. Yeah.
Awesome. And yeah, so we will see you all next time. I think probably in 2 weeks we'll drop our next episode.